First of all, just thank you all for coming and listening in on this talk about transportation today. My name is Anthony Schuette. I am a research associate at Trellis Strategies, and I work a lot on our quantitative research projects as well as on some of our transportation work. So, yeah, I think today we're just going to try and have a good conversation about transportation security and go over some of the data and how we can sort of use a complementary approach to get at some of that qualitative and quantitative data. So I'm trying to think of any housekeeping things. If you have any questions, feel free to just drop them in the chat, and I will stop at a few points so that we can get those answered. So before we dive in and really get into some of the data, I just wanted to sort of give an overview and a roadmap of where we're going. So to start, the thesis statement when we're looking at some of these data solutions is that consistent and reliable transportation to and from campus is really crucial to student success. We know that students who rely on those public or those active transportation types often face barriers that can prevent them from fully participating in their on-campus education. And so what we're trying to do today is understand what the role is of those transportation modes and how students interact with their campus, but then also with their community. So we're going to try and frame the intersection of transportation and higher education through some responses to our student financial wellness survey, which we issue every fall, and then discuss the impacts of secure transportation within the context of higher education. We'll also examine some case studies that seek to address transportation gaps. And then just to note, a lot of this data is really important to some of those conversations that we're having, but it tends to be qualitative. So like I mentioned, we're trying to take that complementary approach and get at some of those qualitative and quantitative data pieces to get a more full picture. So our data ideally should help us to answer whether transportation is preventing students from getting to campus at all, if it's preventing them from arriving on time, if they're being late, or maybe it's the case that they're getting there way too early because, say, for example, they have to leave their house at a certain time to make the bus, but then as a consequence of routes not aligning with course schedules or something like that, they're having to get to campus too early and it's preventing them from doing other things. So that leads me into one other point, and that's that transportation impacts everything else that a person is and does on a day-to-day basis. So we can't really look at transportation as something that only matters to students in the context of being a student. So that's a big part of why reliability is so important. We know that modern learners have other competing interests for their time that require transportation to be efficient and be as timely as possible. So we'll talk more about this in a little bit, but it's important to remember that in transportation, that timely piece is really important. I would also just note that perceptions are often equally as important. So the classic example is that public transportation to a lot of people is statistically safer than driving a car, yet people might say in, say, a state preference survey that they find the opposite to be true. So part of our job is to fill in those knowledge gaps that people have regarding transportation and make them comfortable with using it as a mode option for them. I'll just pause for any questions and see if I can get this up. There we go. So I was mentioning perceptions for a moment, and our student financial wellness survey tries to measure this by asking students, to what extent do you agree that your school makes transportation more affordable? What we found in our fall 2024 survey is that 70% of two-year students agreed or strongly agreed that their school makes transportation more affordable. and 44% of four-year undergraduate students agreed or strongly agreed that their school makes transportation more affordable. A big thing that we often think about when we consider that transportation piece and how students use transportation is finances. Increasingly, transportation research is showing that while finances are really important when we're talking about reliable transportation, students themselves might not always see it that way. So there's been some research done on this. People at the University of Michigan developed this transportation security index, which is based off the food security index. And in doing that, they found a few interesting takeaways. What they found was that cognitive interviews revealed that for respondents, they did not interpret their experiences with symptoms of transportation insecurity as being tied to the cost of transportation. Instead, they reported skipping trips because, for example, the bus never showed up, or the ride with a friend that they had arranged fell through, or that, say, their car needed work and wasn't drivable. In many of these cases, having more financial resources for transportation would have alleviated these problems. If respondents could afford a working car of their own, or even had cash saved for a rideshare in an emergency situation, they wouldn't be counting on those other less reliable options. While us, as outsiders, would probably reach this conclusion given the background of finances and our understanding of them, especially in the role of higher education. In their eyes, in the students' eyes, the problem was the unreliable bus rather than not having money for a car or a rideshare. So, thus, these students in surveys often responded never to questions asking if they had skipped trips because they could not afford the transportation they needed. We also asked students a few other transportation related questions. The one of which is, do you have a car? And then how reliable would you say your car is? In fall 2024, 73% of two-year respondents and 76% of four-year respondents said that they have a car. Among students who had a car, both for two-year and four-year respondents, roughly 80% said that their car was reliable or very reliable. We also asked students if parking is available to them on campus when they need it and whether they used public transportation to get to school. We saw that parking is often more available to two-year students compared to four-year students, with 80% of two-year respondents saying that parking is often or always available to them on campus, and just 41% of four-year undergraduate students saying the same. In terms of public transportation, we saw that 79% of those two-year respondents never, rarely, or sometimes used public transportation to get to school, compared to 73% of our four-year undergraduate respondents. We also asked students, have you ever missed class due to a lack of reliable transportation? What we saw was that just over half, or in the case of those two-year students, 3/5 never missed class due to a lack of reliable transportation. But that leaves a large swath of those students, of those respondents to the survey, who at least once in a while were missing class due to a lack of reliable transportation. What the Student Financial Wellness Survey enables us to do, in addition to just looking at simple responses to the survey questions, we can also look at how the respondents answered certain questions in relation to other questions. So in this case, what we're looking at here is the proportion of students who responded that they always or often miss class due to a lack of reliable transportation. Those are in blue. And then we have those who sometimes, rarely, or never miss class due to a lack of reliable transportation. And those respondents are denoted in orange. What we see is that those students who were more often missing class less often had cars. So just 44% of those who were often missing class said that they have a car. And that's compared to almost 4/5 of students who sometimes, rarely, or never miss class who said that they have a car. In addition, among those who had a car in these two groups, those students who were not missing class often more often said that their car was reliable or very reliable. We also asked students about that parking question in relation to these other questions. And what you'll see here is that parking was more often available to those students who weren't missing class often. We can also see that students who experience financial difficulties or challenges were more often those who were missing class due to a lack of reliable transportation. We can also see that the association between public transportation usage and both academic and financial stability extends beyond the classroom. Students who reported often or always using public transportation were more likely to receive various types of public assistance. This highlights those very real barriers that are existing in terms of those demographics and accessing college campuses, particularly when we're talking about personal vehicles. So you'll see that those gaps are really evident for food assistance, housing assistance, utility assistance, and also medical assistance. I'll take a quick pause here and see if there are any questions before I move on to a couple of our more quantitative case studies. Great. So before we talk about some of these quantitative methods to getting at some of these transportation issues, I just wanted to note some of the things that we know from prior research, given the relationship between higher education and transportation. What we know is that the more time students are on campus, the better they do in school. Paramount to getting students on campus is ensuring that they can reliably get there on a day-to-day basis. Unreliable transportation, in addition to preventing students from attending classes altogether, has some other time costs. Students with less financial stability, those are those students who often have fewer transportation choices as a consequence of their financial instability, may also have some additional time constraints that make transportation increasingly burdensome for them. Research finds that students with longer commute times are less likely to travel to campus and participate in on campus activities. Going along with that, public transportation has been found to take between 1.5 and 2.5 times longer than driving a car to cover that same distance. And then on top of that, students also have to walk to those stops. Broadly, we find that people are generally willing to walk up to half of a mile to get to a stop, with some people only willing to walk up to a quarter of a mile to get to a stop. So both of these compounding things are contributing to those longer commute times. And then given the relationship that we've mentioned between income and public transportation usage and the increase in time inequality since the 1980s, students with the longest commute times are also likely those most time impoverished. And time poverty has been associated with lower well-being, physical health, and productivity. Believe. So in our fall 2024 survey, I believe we had uh, right around 100,000 students surveyed. I'll pause for any other questions on the Student Financial Wellness Survey. Great. So moving on. So given all of these issues, given all of the complexity that exists in terms of trying to get students to campus reliably using systems that are often in many ways not designed for these students, uh, we need some methods, some quantitative methods to better understand issues that exist here. So our first case study looks at a community college in Texas with several campus locations that is experiencing rapid growth in part of its service area. So we're seeking to identify whether adequate services exist to meet this new demand. So how should we go about examining this issue? there are likely a few different considerations when we're trying to look at this. So first of all, we can use general transit feed specification or GTFS data to plot public transportation systems and examine their routes and scheduling. So with student geographic data, often from IR departments, we can see to what extent students can access their campuses through public transportation. So you'll see a few things here. First, there are these orange dots that are campus locations. The colored lines are bus routes, and the color-coded dots along them are stops. So they're color-coded for how often a bus stops at that location within a 2-hour time frame. So those more green and blue dots here are stops where the bus stops more frequently, and those that are color coded closer to white are where the bus stops less often in a 2-hour time period. Finally, there's that heat map that's kind of in the background there. And that's shaded such that areas with a high number of applicants are shown in yellow. So something like this area here. And areas with few applicants, say somewhere out here, are shown in blue. So what we're trying to identify here is whether service exists at the campus. And what we see is that most often it does. And then we're also trying to see whether stops exist near where students live, which by and large stops do exist. However, what we'll notice is that particularly in these areas with a large number of prospective students, uh, these stops don't stop very often. So this can have some complications when we're talking about scheduling, as well as when we're talking about students who need to transfer to another bus in order to get to a campus, whether those students are adequately served by this system. Indeed, what we ended up finding at this college was that transportation access was a factor related to matriculation. So you can see that for each of public transportation, campus access via driving and then campus access via walking, students who had access via those modes more often matriculated at the institution, and that was statistically significant and was in excess often of 5 percentage points more likely. So car access and walking, you'll see, are also very important here. We tend not to talk a ton about the walking, just given how unrealistic it is for most students, but walking is certainly also an important factor here. So we've kind of started to talk about this a little bit, but crucial to this conversation is often that first and last mile transportation piece. So often the most critical component is identifying how that transportation user will cover the first and last mile of their journey. These components are often the most difficult, particularly for public transportation users, because of how few options exist to cover this distance. We can discern whether first or last mile barriers exist, kind of like we were talking about on that previous slide, by evaluating how far students live from a bus stop or how far our campus is from a stop. There's some data out there suggesting that just over half of community college campuses across the country have a stop within half a mile of their campus location. So even just having that stop on campus is not necessarily a guarantee, and that can be a big last mile barrier for students. So often, a really simple way to start to get at that first and last mile barriers is just by using Google Maps and getting directions from various places to a campus. So Google will tell you how much walking is needed, how long the trip will take relative to driving, things like that can help us at least get that initial sense of how much a last mile barrier exists to our campus. When we're talking about trying to alleviate some of these issues, things like microtransit, shared bikes or scooters, and then also just bolstering pedestrian infrastructure are all considerations to cover those first and last miles. From here, we can then start to assess whether we need to step in to provide other services like a shuttle or a non-fixed route service, such as mobility on demand, to help students cover that distance. So when we do this, it's important to consider that these services need to be able to get students to and from campus consistently, which means reliably, safely, and at a consistent time each day. So one other thing to consider, especially when we're talking about this, and this starts to get at that last mile barrier as well, is that sometimes transit is nearby, but students still don't have access because there isn't a stop, or due to some existing built infrastructure, getting to the stop is prohibitively difficult for them. So what we're seeing here is a campus, and that's noted in orange, that's located near two bus lines within that range that we talked about earlier, being up to roughly half a mile, that students are willing to walk between the stop and campus. What you'll notice here is that the issue is the green line doesn't have any stops nearby, these dots here that are evident on the orange line. Um, and the orange line, while it appears to be within this range, in order for students to get from the campus to the stop, they would actually have to walk up and past this highway to a bridge where they can then walk down to either this stop here or this stop here. And by that time, they're well beyond 1 mile walked. And that's just not a realistic expectation for students to get to campus on a consistent basis. So that's another instance where that first last mile access is really important. And it's also an area where we as institutions can step in to better enable campus access. So I mentioned on-demand services or regular shuttles. Both things like that can help students bridge that transit gap. Many schools have also developed services that offer to pick students up where they are, so long as they're within certain zones or within a set proximity to campus. So we could do that with that service that I mentioned earlier, mobility on demand, which create dynamic routes for a shuttle operator that doesn't require set stop locations or rigid routes and schedules. So it's more like a big shared Uber than it is like a traditional bus. So you would just request a ride through the app, and then the app dynamically edits the route to best accommodate everyone using the service at that time. In that way, we also don't necessarily need to have the infrastructure footprint that traditional public transportation has. Just to really try and illustrate this in one final way, what we're looking at here is in purple is that area within a 10-minute walk from this campus location. You'll see, again, like we've seen earlier, we have some of these bus routes and in this instance, train routes that are going along this city. And you can see that within a 10-minute walk of campus, which is, again, corresponding to that roughly between quarter of a mile and half a mile, we have some bus routes that are within that range. But then we also have some train routes that lie just outside of that range. And what that means is when we go and look at the broader map of public transportation infrastructure in a given area, there are often only a portion of the system that is usable for the purposes of commuting to and also between campuses. So you'll see here we have this entire transportation route and system, which is everything in the gray. And then these colored lines are those that can reach a campus. So only this northern portion and only a select few routes, even within that northern portion, are able to access any of these campuses. And as a consequence, this system that seems really big and robust is not exactly as big and robust as it would seem for these students. Before we move on to some of these best practices, I'll just pause for a moment and see if we have any questions.
Anthony, there was one question in the chat. How many students were surveyed in this study that you're reviewing?
Yeah, so we're at roughly 100,000 for this most recent year. Great. Okay, I'm not seeing any others, so I'll just continue on. So when we're talking about on-campus solutions, oh, let's see what we got. Oh, thanks. So in terms of on-campus solutions, we have a variety of options, and these options are often all best utilized as components of our larger transportation strategy. So, uh, one classic example is providing Uber or Lyft vouchers to assist students in getting into campus. Um, a lot of schools already use this, and it's often best used as a sort of emergency system where students who say, have a car that breaks down and need some emergency assistance for, say, a week or two. That's where those Uber or Lyft vouchers can really step in and be really helpful. Um, Another big part is aligning our course scheduling that can support transportation patterns. Oftentimes, these transit system operators, they're serving a wide array of people, and as a consequence, especially given that they often are serving the work commuters first, um, their schedules don't necessarily align with course schedules, particularly for, say, our modern learners, our learners who are adults, who might be parents, who might also be workers. Those sorts of students are often left out of this conversation. So scheduling is a really important component of this transportation strategy. So if a student is really faced with deciding to attend class or make it home timely and safely, um, it's really not a contest. They're going to choose getting home on time every time. So sometimes we as stewards of education need to realize when class ought to be priority number one and when it really isn't realistic for it to be the top priority of our students. Microsites are another option. They can aid students in getting to campus by simply reducing the distance that they have to go to be served by education. So this idea of microsites, both as a way to make education more accessible, but then also to make transportation more accessible. Um, Thinking about it in that dual purpose sense is often helpful. So finally, I would just add that making our campuses places that students can be for extended periods of time can help to alleviate the burden of inadequate transportation. So if a student can take care of their other responsibilities on campus, if they're more likely to be able to not have to choose between responsibilities, that can really help them to, say, make that trip, even if it's at an inconvenient time. Um, they can get to campus, say take that work call or arrange a doctor's office visit or something like that, a space where they can go and have a realistic expectation of privacy and of the ability to be productive. I mentioned those vouchers, and I think it's a really good example of a modern solution for our modern learners. So Uber, for example, has this higher ed voucher plan. The service enables schools to offer flexible types of discounted rides to students in a way that's convenient for institutions and is also already integrated with that Uber system, that transportation service that most students are likely familiar with and may already use. So you can do things like set the type of payment structure, whether it's a subsidy or a co-payment, limit the usage to certain times or certain zones, and then limit that overall usage if needed. So I've left a link there below, and I believe we're going to make these slides available to all of you after the fact. So if you're interested in learning more about that at all, feel free to take a look at that. I would also just highlight there are a ton of ways to make using public transportation less overwhelming. So oftentimes, the first time a person uses public transportation, it can be an uncomfortable experience. First of all, just in that, you may not understand how the system works. You may not understand where you're going or where you need to get off. Do I pull the lever? Do I not? Like, there are a ton of different considerations that can make it a scary experience. And it doesn't have to be that way, especially today. So today, you can load fares onto your phone, so you don't have to carry another card. If your card doesn't work for whatever reasons, a lot of systems allow for things like Apple and Google Pay with a tap, just like you would use your card. And a lot of systems today also do live tracking of their buses and trains that eliminate the guesswork from wondering when you're going to be picked up. Many transit authorities also already operate micromobility and on-demand mobility within certain zones of their service areas, and those offer door-to-door service with the ability to transfer to any fixed route service. So the examples here are from Metro Mobility in Minneapolis. So you'll see the first is just a simple bus tracking, and then on the right is showing a zone in which you can be picked up for door-to-door service. So putting these tools into the hands of students and just helping them to understand that in many ways this does not have to be an overwhelming experience, and getting them comfortable with, say those first few times of riding can help them to get to campus reliably, even when they are taking modes that sometimes feel unreliable, or when they need to take them temporarily as a consequence of some other exogenous factor. Just check chat quick. Right. So finally, I just wanted to highlight the importance of partnerships in all of this. So, especially when we're trying to address a problem that is so entrenched in things that can often feel outside of our control as members of the higher education community, working with outside voices and people at other organizations, whether those be private or public organizations, that's a big step and a big thing to do that we can do for our students. We found at Trellis and being a part of these conversations is that finding shared goals and evaluating the existing system we have and identifying possible paths to change, as well as engaging students and other community voices, can be really impactful. It's important to remember that as we do this, our goals will not necessarily perfectly align with the goals of our partners, but there will likely be those intersection points that we can try to build off of. So things like, adjusting schedules as it relates to course schedules, engaging in discussion with those regional transit authorities, engaging learner voices, and then potentially making infrastructure changes, stop or route changes, or even just sharing data and getting a better sense of those intersection points can be really beneficial. So at this point, I'm going to stop and ask if there are any additional questions. This is the best part of a webinar because I can just sit here all day. Are there any institutions that you see implementing these practices well? Okay, yeah. So I'll give you two examples. The first is Rio Hondo College, and there's a very notable study out from them that I imagine some of the people in this audience have likely seen, where they gave universal transit passes to their students. And what they ended up seeing was that those students who had those passes were retained more often a semester later, a year later, and were more likely to have earned a credential. I believe it was a 27% increase in the likelihood of earning a credential came off of that transit pass. I would also highlight Macalester College is another good one, who have given, yes, absolutely. Macalester College is another great example in that they both gave those transit passes out and also did some infrastructure things in their community to make walking more of an option. It's in a city, so that is more of an option for them. I would also just highlight, um, not necessarily attributed to any one school, but it's becoming increasingly common to offer car repairs to students for free, and then it's students in trade programs who are doing those repairs. They're getting workplace experience, and the students are also getting their cars fixed. There's that link to Rio Hondo's program. And I believe if you look up the UPass program, you'll be able to find that study very easily. I would also just note that we have a transportation toolkit coming out, I believe, hopefully next week. If you take a look at our website, we cite that study in the toolkit, and it's a really great study. And I think there's a ton of insight to be gleaned from that study. All right, seeing none, thank you all for coming and attending today and sharing your insights and asking questions. We really appreciate it. Yeah, just stay on the lookout for our future events, and for any research that we put out there on that research hub. And yeah, thanks and have a great rest of your day.